You are listening to Ask An Asexual. This is part of the Ask Us series, a short-run podcast dedicated to breaking myths and stereotypes by asking real people. I'm Sheena, and I'm joined today by author and podcaster Heather Rose Jones and author Alex Woods. Thank you both for joining me today. Last week we touched briefly on asexuality in relation to celibacy, and this week we're going to dive in and get some more details on what it actually means and what the difference is between being an asexual and being someone who's celibate. Because, as I discovered this week, it's actually very different. Okay, so let's talk about it.
Well, technically, celibacy as a technical term is about choice. It's about choosing to not engage in sexual relationships, historically it was about choosing not to get married, because everybody assumed that marriage and sex were, functionally equivalent. And very often it was in a religious context where you either because sex was something dirty and you wanted to be pure for God, or because a relationship with another person was a distraction, was, a deviation away from focusing on God. So this was a reason why not just in Christianity, but in a number of religions, sort of the ultimate in being a holy person was to be celibate, because then you could devote not simply that attention and that emotional energy, but a sense of like that physical energy towards your religious life as opposed to your physical life. So equating celibacy with asexuality really hinges around misunderstanding the volitionality. It misunderstands the choice aspect. Asexuals don't have a choice whether to be asexual. They do have a choice how they want to act on that. And there's also the aspect that we've talked about several times, that asexuality is this broad spectrum of how asexuals feel about physically engaging in sex. So yes, an asexual can also choose to be celibate, although very often that's easier for them than it would be for an allosexual. But it's not the same thing at all.
Do you think that going into religious service, like becoming a nun, for example, would be a natural thing for an asexual to want to do, especially in historical context where they, rather than getting married, let's say?
Well, it's complicated because people didn't always have, going into a religious life was not always a matter of personal choice. There were a lot of economic and familial aspects to it. I'm thinking primarily of European history because that's my specialty. But, if your family did not want you to go into a convent, they could prevent you from going into a convent unless you worked really, really hard at it. And in fact, some of the early stories of female saints are all about their families not wanting them to become nuns. And they, run away from home multiple times until finally their family gives in and says, okay, you can do this. So while it might have been an option, there were a lot of other factors involved. And I guess it would be one thing people might think about, if they very much wanted to avoid being put in a situation of having to be in a sexual relationship. But I think people had a different attitude that is like the whole idea of, sex is a voluntary part of marriage as opposed to sex is just, it comes with the territory, kind of like, eating and sleeping and that. The idea that this is something you could opt out of for personal preference reasons in the past was not necessarily, a thing that people considered. But conversely, I think you will find that there are people who were in a celibate religious life or in a celibate life not religious, in regular society, where they found that a very comfortable thing to do because they were also asexual. So one of the examples that I like to use is the 19th century concept of romantic friendship for women, where there's a bit of a pernicious stereotype during the 19th century that women in general are not supposed to be sexual beings. They are not supposed to experience sexual desire. It's kind of a lower class thing, And so the ideal for upper class women, middle class and upper class women, was that they would not be sexual beings. They would, lie back and think of England, as the saying goes. And so for women who were averse to having sex of any type, using this image of the non-sexual romantic friendship was a thing that society understood and would recognize, they would respect. And you didn't have to get into the whole thing about, well, no, it's because generally I think sex is icky in general. It's like, oh, no, I am a pure and noble and high-minded lady, and it's easy for me because I don't really want it. So it's complicated. In looking for positive models of asexuality in history, you keep running into the problem of those same models being very sex negative. In looking at religious celibacy, there's a long strain of society viewing religious celibacy in a sex negative way. That either it's because sex is dirty and awful and aren't these people wonderful for not doing it, or, oh, but everybody naturally is a sexual being, and therefore if they're pretending that they're good and noble and a non-sexual, that they're just hypocrites. So it gets very, very complicated in history.
I'm beginning to learn that asexuality is just very complicated.
People are complicated.
Well, this is true, but yes, people are complicated. I think that's probably the best way to say this.
I'm very interested in medical history. It's one of my big hobbies I have. I have big collection of books and stuff through my old education and since I worked in the hospital. And I just looked up one of my oldest books. It's around from 1750. And to read all the things they try to do to cure people of different sexual desires, or when women didn't want to sleep with the man and so on. It's really scary. So I'm quite happy that we don't have at least this problem anymore.
Yeah, historically, there has been this strong pressure to channel people into a very narrow range of sexual experience. That whether you're, oversexed or undersexed or whatever, or if you've got, the inappropriate object of your sexual desire, it's not just something that gets aimed at asexuals. It has always been the case that society wants you to have this very narrow range of experience.
Can you share some of that?
It was mostly focused on women. Everything you read in the past back that was stated was about women, and it's mostly put into the hysteria category. Basically, if the woman didn't behave like the man wanted her to, it was categorized as hysteria, and if they couldn't treat the woman at home, that she wouldn't follow the given path, they just basically, in the end, they locked them up in insane asylums. And since the women didn't have any right to speak for themselves, the only thing that really was needed was documentation from their physician and from the husband. They wrote the papers, and then the woman was locked up maybe for some months, years, forever, because she wouldn't follow what the man wanted her to be in the rest of basically in the marriage.
And when you look at more recently, people want to assume that if you're asexual, it's because of some sort of trauma. It's like, oh, you got assaulted, you got molested, you're afraid of sex. And I wish that especially lesbians and bisexual women would step back and think about how those same things have been thrown at them with regard to sexuality. Is like, as much as I had a wonderful relationship with my mother with regard to my coming out, one of the first things that came out of her mouth was, is this because somebody molested you? That was about liking women. And I wish that when people come up with the, oh, well, you haven't met the right person yet, you haven't had the right experience yet, you must have had some sort of sexual trauma. It's like, are you listening to yourselves? Do you remember when people said these things to you about your sexuality?
Yes, because they think it must be based on something that happened to you. You can't be just born this way. They can accept maybe that you are born gay, lesbian, transsexual, whatever, but they can't accept that you are born as an asexual because you don't choose to be asexual. It is just what it is.
Yeah, and if you choose to be, quote unquote, choose to be asexual, that's what celibacy is. That's choosing to not have sex.
Right. Celibacy is a choice. Asexuality is not a choice. The way choosing to marry a guy if you're a lesbian is a choice, but being a lesbian is not a choice. Right?
Yes.
Bingo.
Haha.
Absolutely.
I might finally get this. Do either of you have anything else you want to add to this particular topic?
About the only thing I would add is I did an episode in my podcast about models, sort of archetypal models of asexual lesbians in history, and looking at contexts where one of the social models that people had available to them is one that modeled asexuality. Not necessarily that all the women participating in that lifestyle, oh my God, that word, but not necessarily that all the women participating in that lifestyle were asexual, but that it was a lifestyle that was very friendly to asexuality. So if people want to take a look at ways in which asexuality has been depicted positively in history, check out that episode of my podcast. It's the one titled Beguines, Boston Marriages, and Bed Death, or something like that. And as I say, it conflates asexuality and sex negativity in some unfortunate ways. And that's just because history is awful.
History is awful.
When people always ask me, would you like to live another time period? Because I live in a way that is like hundreds of years ago, or apply things that still work from hundreds of years ago. I always say, I have no problem with my outhouse at my cabin, but I like my indoor plumbing and I like to live the way that I live now and not to be hunted down and burned at the stake. Thank you.
Yeah, and, as a historian, well, it used to be, I would say, there's no time I want to live in other than the present, except now can we like take it back like a decade, just one decade, and live then instead. But I would have been very comfortable living the life of a mid-19th century romantic friend. That would have been a type of relationship that I would have been happy in. I would not have felt like I was missing anything. My only, personal tragedy would be if the woman I was in love with decided she wanted conventional marriage instead, which of course happened on any number of occasions. But in terms of what my ideal relationship looks like, it would be that. It would be that type of relationship and have it be valued and celebrated by society.
Do you think it's more difficult nowadays to be an asexual woman with all of the kind of sexual revolution that's been going on around women? Women are standing up, claiming our sexuality, our sexual power, like our own satisfaction and that kind of thing. And then, do you feel excluded? Do you feel like this is something that you just can't relate to?
I can relate to the wanting to having the same rights as men have, cis men. I can relate to that. You absolutely have to stand up for yourself if you think that you are not as valued in your society as men are. And even I think it's totally okay, like that women also talk about their one-night stands and how many sexual partners they have. But the problem I see personally for me is that everything gets so over-sexualized. There is nothing else in a relationship, in media, that is portrayed another way. That's my problem with the whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's the same thing that happened to women in general with the sexual revolution of the 60s, where once it is acceptable to be open about sexual desire, then suddenly the switch flips over and you are expected to be open and enthusiastic about sexual desire. And that there is the strong sense that if you don't experience sexual desire the same way everybody else does, now that it's okay, that now there's something wrong with you. I think that the openness of people talking about their sexual lives does make it more obvious that society considers anything other than that prototypical experience to be abnormal. Whereas if nobody was talking about sex, then nobody didn't know you weren't having it.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, like I grew up partly in Scotland as a child before my parents moved here. And there were 3 topics you would never talk about to your friends. The first one is money. You don't talk about money. We still don't do it today in our society where I live. The second thing is what is going on in your family and emotions. And the third thing is you don't talk about sex. It's private. And it still holds up here. The younger people really try to break this, but the older generation still holds to these values, and I'm completely okay with it.
Yeah, in fact, I'd say of those 3, the taboo that still holds on the strongest is don't talk about money.
You have been listening to Ask An Asexual. I'm Sheena, and I was joined today by Heather Rose Jones and Alex Woods. Check out the show notes to links about things discussed in this episode. If you enjoy this podcast, then come and talk to us on the Lesbian Talk Show chat group on Facebook. You can email us on podcast@thelesbiantalkshow.com or follow us on Twitter @lesbiantalkshow. You can also join our community of patrons and get exclusive content. Go to patreon.com/thelesbiantalkshow. The link is in the show notes. Find this and other exciting podcasts. All you need to do is search for The Lesbian Talk Show anywhere that you listen to podcasts.